around the world today. Hello, my name is Tony Barongo Taria, that is, and I am a women's self-care and health coach for Black women over the age of 40 here on my channel. If you're new, I talk all things self-care, wellness, travel, empowerment of Black women. In short, helping Black women get undomesticated and get off the altar of other people's expectations. And today, as always, this time of the week, Sundays at noon, Central Standard Time, I like to talk about self care, especially as we are wrapping up the week. Many of us are getting ready to go back to work or prepping for the work week. Mm, had to sip on my tea. Today, I am talking about the difference between within the context of self care, remember, within the context of decolonized self care, I'm talking today about the difference between walls and setting boundaries. And I know many of us, though, for those of you who've been following me for a little bit and who also had the opportunity to catch up on the replays here on the channel, I've been talking about archetypes of Black women who are getting themselves to an early grave. I've talked about that within the context of Ryan Coogler's Sinners movie. But by and large, I've talked about self care and self care that is decolonized. And I specify decolonized because I'm talking about a version of self care that is relevant to us as Black women and Black people. I will never stop talking about the fact that there are two versions circulating out there on the interwebs and the world at large that's being popularized by mainstream media. And the one being popularized by mainstream media, I'm here to tell you, as I stated in an earlier video, that wasn't built for us. If you want a quick way to continue to experience burnout as a Black woman, to continue to be frustrated and overwhelmed and just not feeling well, feeling a lot of dis-ease in your body, not feeling renewed, not feeling replenished, you'll stay on that hamster wheel going nowhere, also known as the colonized version of self-care, which is a hodgepodge of appropriated strategies and tools from other cultures that have been commodified and put out there to basically relieve you of your money. Because guess what? There are so many ways to nurture, replenish, strengthen, and heal your body without paying hundreds of dollars in some weird studio surrounded by people who don't look like you and calling that wellness. I don't call that wellness. I call that harmful and continuing to put yourself in spaces that do not heal or nurture you as a Black woman. And so today I'm talking about knowing the difference between building walls and actually creating or setting boundaries. Now, I'm referencing a few of my notes here because I wanted to hark back to something I'd mentioned earlier in terms of the archetypes of Black women that are leading themselves to a quick and dirty, you know, path to leaving this earth earlier than they intended. Okay, I had mentioned before the archetypes of the strong back woman, the sojourner, sisterella, superwoman. Those were all toxic versions of dealing and coping with living in a society that is anti-Black, that is racist, and that is built on oppression. And those are all those are all archetypes of strategies that at some point they may have worked and helped us in terms of surviving as people and particularly as Black women navigating this space where we have so many points of intersectionality, points where where you're dealing with misogynoir, you're dealing with patriarchy, you're dealing with racism, you're dealing with institutionalized white supremacy. There are all these points of internet interconnectedness where where you encounter different forms of oppression based on the body and gender that you exist in. Okay, and so today when I speak of boundaries, I'm talking about yes to saying boundaries are saying yes. I have my notes here when it comes to boundaries are about saying no to the things that don't serve you, but not just that, you're also saying yes to the things that make your life richer, that heal, hi Amari, that nourish your soul. It's not about creating walls are built largely on fear and intergenerational trauma, and it is a survival response that in the short term there are some benefits to that. It's about survivability, but these were never strategies that were going to be sustainable and carry you through to a healthy and full life. And that's why when it comes to knowing the difference between those two, that can really impact your health and wellness, especially if you are trying to deal with things like burnout, if you're trying to reclaim your health and wellness and get your own self care journey started and in a manner that is sustainable. We've all, everybody has done that whole New Year's resolution. I'm talking about now the aspect of self-care that deals with fitness and strength training. That's an aspect of self-care. Fitness in that is an aspect of self-care. But we've all had that thing where we said, oh, I got this New Year's resolution, I'm gonna go to the gym every day, I'm gonna at this time, and only to meet the beginning of the year you're able to do it for a couple of weeks and then you fall off the wagon because what? Life gets in the way. And why does that not work? Why does that New Year's resolution? By the way, I don't believe in them. I used to be one that participated in the madness known as those New Year's resolutions, but over the years I've gained wisdom through my own journey and training to know that those just basically set you up for failure. They're not based in reality. Largely, they're not based in reality, and they're based on some weird mental map that actually, when you break it down and deconstruct it, it's actually built on something that's has to do with outside validation rather than your own health and wellness journey. So that's a whole nother rant and there's a whole nother story. But when it comes to self-care, building building walls, knowing the difference between between walls and again, um, boundaries. It's really important because you don't want to continue to replicate a cycle that's harmful to your own health and well-being. And when you exist in a mindset where everything you're doing is built and structured around fear and self-protection, you end up isolating yourself. You're unable to receive the help and support that you need. I've spoken about this a number of times. If self-care is really your goal, getting healthy, well, and healed mentally, spiritually, emotionally, especially as a Black woman existing in this society, you're going to need to get a mental health provider on your team. It means going to need someone in the capacity of, say, like what I do as a women's self-care and health coach, whether that's intimately or continuously, but you also need someone to guide you and help the healing process along, who is a professional in that space. That's not me. That's not what I do. I do radicalized, decolonized self-care, and I take my clients through those intensives. Usually they're anywhere from 45 to 2 hours. It just depends on them because I find that you need that kind of pattern interrupt along your self-care journey. Not necessarily not needed continuously, but you need that interruption in order to heal and move forward in your personal journey, self-care journey, and to live your best possible life. But I always say you do need to have a mental health provider on your team, because there are a lot of stuff we carry, whether you want to admit it or not. We have all been traumatized, and we carry generational trauma simply by virtue of the fact of what our ancestors went through, being dragged and violently removed from their homes and cultures to exist and build this country. They went through a lot. I will always tell the story of how I remember my mom having a conversation with my granddad. He was from North Carolina. My grandma was from Mobile, Alabama. And I will never forget some of the horrifying, you could just feel the energy. And one of his parents was a sharecropper. And my grandma, her family, she came from a family of sharecroppers, and that was just the life they lived. But you could see, even in their faces, just looking back on those memories, you can remember seeing the trauma of those memories associated with that and coming through and surviving that. So you can only imagine carrying that trauma through your life if you don't have the appropriate mental health providers to help you along with that. And again, in a previous live, I spoke to the fact that I know we are living in interesting times. People are trying to watch their budget. People are trying to increase their savings so that they have emergency resources and things of that nature. And I also spoke about the other day about how you can access mental health providers, because that's, the sucky thing about the healthcare system in this country. It's not robust at all. And even if you do have healthcare benefits through your provider, a lot of times the mental health side of things is woefully under resourced. And so for those who are talking about, well, I don't really have money to address my mental health in that capacity, I spoke of ways that that can be done. So if you haven't watched that live, you can go and watch the previous live where I spoke of what to do if you can't afford a mental health provider or you can't afford to self-care. It's under that, and I laid out some strategies about how you can do that. Now, getting back to the whole notion of decolonized self-care and boundaries versus walls, I spoke that, I mentioned again that, it goes beyond, the pop psychology stuff you see in mainstream media where they, give you all of these catchy terms, but nobody really tells you, the truth about it. True self-care, true, the difference between boundaries versus walls. Like I said, walls have a tendency, if you find yourself isolating, I guess that's a good, warning sign, a good flag if you're trying to figure out, okay, am I setting up boundaries or am I setting up walls? If your protections, and I say that in quote, are not about giving communication and addressing your needs and making sure other people understand what that is, you're probably erecting walls. And walls have a tendency to be destructive in the sense that you become isolated. If you find yourself detached from other people, not, in community with, especially with other Black women, you're not in community with other women, you don't feel supported. You feel like in your head, you start to feel like, oh my God, I feel like I'm struggling. I'm going through this all on my own. Those are indicators that you've probably erected walls, and those are built essentially on trauma. A lot of that has to do with trauma, whether it's yours in the present or it's been carried generationally through. I understand, and as a Black woman, I can attest to the fact that when it comes to statistics, they're pretty grim in terms of the kinds of trauma that Black women in general, as a collective, have experienced by between the ages of 12 and 21. And that's a short span of life to experience so much trauma. And unfortunately, a lot of Black women have experienced that statistically. The research is out there. I'm not going to go into the weeds about that. But understand with that context in mind, it's understandable how our first thing seems to be to build walls. That's why we have this notion of the strong Black woman. We have all these archetypes: the sisterella, the strong Black woman, the superwoman, the sojourner. These are all archetypes I spoke of in previous lives. I don't want to go too much into that, but it all has to do with these are modalities that were they worked in the short term in terms of survival mode, but you can't live in survival mode indefinitely. It actually starts to break down your body. It tends to elevate your cortisol level. It tends to elevate all of your trauma responses. You're constantly on, and there's no downtime. You wonder why, okay, I'm having such difficulty sleeping. Why can't I stop my thoughts from racing? These are indicators that you're more than likely living stuck in that survival mode in some way, shape, or form. When you're dealing as a Black woman working in the whether it's corporate or any other job space, we know that it's not unexpected. In fact, at this point, we largely expect to encounter microaggressions. The research has been done, the work has been done by people much smarter than me, much smarter than a lot of us, that attest to the fact that with those dealing with microaggressions, systemic oppression, and discrimination that we go through, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's us accessing the healthcare system, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's just existing and driving or living while Black, that survival mode and these strategies that were never designed to be sustainable, they're actually having a negative effect on us, on our mental health. And Black women are hit particularly hard in the mental health arena with things like depression, inability to sleep. All of these things are indicators of that. And so that's why I'm so radical and so passionate about decolonized self care, because that is a version of self care that is culturally relevant, that harkens back to our ways and culture of being nourishing, that taps into community healing modalities, that taps into mutual aid and collectivism that is that is necessary to us as a people. It's intrinsic to our culture, and it's something that when it's stripped away, the absence of it has very negative effects. That's just the reality of it. You wonder why you can, that's why I always give the example of a Black woman paying all this money to go to a yoga studio, and there's no one in there that looks like her. She's the only Black woman in that space. You are in survival mode trying to self care. Imagine the insanity of that. And that's why, I'm so joyful and happy about Black yoga instructors that are creating spaces for Black women to be healed and to get healthy in spaces where they feel safe. And that's one of the things, too, when it comes to boundaries versus setting boundaries versus creating walls. Like I said before, walls are built on isolation and they're built out of fear. And they do nothing in terms of protection. It gives a false sense of security. Whereas setting boundaries, it is very intentional. It is very relevant to healing and balance and alignment. It's built on communication and it's built on self awareness. And this is why, another reason why, too, when I speak of the version of self care that I'm all about and that I work with when it comes to clients, too, is that self care starts up here. It starts up here. It starts in the mind. Why? It's the human condition. It's the nature of being human is self-awareness. And if you're not aware of your current state, if you don't know that you're in survival mode, you're feeling overwhelmed, you just feel like one ball of misery, there's a lot going on there. And a lot of times, when you're living in survival mode, you're like that hamster on a wheel. You get up, you go to work, you deal with the microaggressions, you deal with the politics of working as a black person or a black woman in a black body or black femme in a black body, and you deal with it and you put one foot in front of the other, you rinse and repeat, and you wonder why you're miserable. You wonder why you can't lose that weight that you've been trying to lose for weeks, for months, for years. You go on these fad diets. Again, all of this stuff that was never built for you. And I've tried all that. I can speak to that because I've tried it. And it might work for a little bit while you're on that super duper crazy fad diet. And I call it fad diet because, again, all of these things have one thing, have so many commonalities, and they're all built on systems of oppression. They're exploitative and they're extractive. The way we look at food, the way we nourish our bodies, we need to deconstruct the way we look at food, especially in our communities, our cultural dishes, our cultural ways of preparing these foods and dishes, the way we look at dishes when we talk about, oh, yeah, what does a healthy diet look like? The quote unquote food pyramid. We need to deconstruct the white supremacy behind that. I know it's a lot, and that's why self-care is it's work. It's work. True self-care is not the self-indulgence and the photos, beautiful Instagram photos you see flashing across your feed. It's not that. It's real work. It's sometimes it's messy because you have to work on yourself internally. But at the end of the day, you're grounded, you're whole, you are replenished, you are renewed. But more than that, you have a level of awareness and comfort in your own body that only comes from working through your ish and really reclaiming self care, the decolonized version of it. That means bringing back, pulling in your culture and indigenous practices as Black people, as people of the diaspora that have been carried through to this place we live in. I remember, I will never forget on my mom's side because I am I feel that spirit of being at the crossroads a lot. I feel it a lot more now because actually I am one of those people that's at the crossroads. I have half of my family is from the black America with mixed in with indigenous, and then I have one side of me that is from West Africa directly, and so I have access to all of those lineages and those ancestral practices. And I remember, I will never forget some of the healing remedies, some of the practices and rituals that were involved for women and girls going through certain stages of their lives that were designed to heal and educate them about their own bodies, about their own wellness, what to do when you feel this, how to access these certain practices. There were certain practices I remember on my dad's side where when women are getting ready to give birth, there's a certain close practice involved with that. It's still practiced today in my dad's village in Nigeria, where there's a certain close practice for women who are getting ready to give birth. There's a certain way of caring for women and teaching women how to self-care for themselves in anticipation of giving birth. And then there are those that enter in there are elderly women and practices that they bring to as a community to surround and support her through that process. Those are things that we lost when our people were brought here with violence and all kinds of atrocities committed against us. We lost a lot of that, but we also carried some of that knowledge here. We see that in the Deep South, where there's certain practices and ways of healing that I never forget my grandma on my mom's side. She used to do. She had a garden. They moved from the South to the West Coast, and she was a gardener. She loved plants, but she used to do some, what I used to think was some weird ish with plants, and she would have us eat them as girls. And looking back, I was like, oh, that's what you were doing. I see you, Grandma. I see you. I see what you were doing now. And it's time for us in our practices. And this is why even though I speak of self care, decolonized self care on in social media, I don't go deeply into it in this interwebs. Why? Because I recognize that a lot of our practices are culture vultured. A lot of our practices that should be gate kept are not being kept like they should, honored and kept closed as they should. And so that's why I delve into a little bit of that when I work with Black women offline in my intensive self care sessions. But again, this in general terms, when it comes to self care, you have to know the difference again between setting boundaries versus creating walls, because creating walls is counterproductive to what you're trying to achieve. You want to be poured into, you want to be nourished, you want to have your needs met, but you can't get any of that if there's no communication involved, if there's no real community around you and support, where you build trust within community, and that helps to heal you as well. Because another thing, when it comes to self-care, not just at the individual level, when it comes to practicing self-care, you have to create that space individually for you to practice that. And when you're creating that space, whether it's at home in your bedroom, whether it's somewhere in your basement, if you have the space, I always say you need to physically create that space, but you also have to do it mentally, emotionally as well. And the very rudimentary portion of creating a space for self care starts in the physical realm. But the real work is manifested up here, because what? You have to have that self awareness. You have to determine, what is it that I want from this whole process? You have to communicate that to others, and you have to set ground rules, or what some have called contracts. And it's not just creating contracts and, in the physical term, but if you want to delve off into the spiritual aspect of that too, when you communicate, you're always in some degree creating a contract of sorts. And that, what does a contract do? It lays out the terms of engagement. And that's what you're doing when it comes to setting boundaries. What is acceptable, who you allow, what do you allow within your sacred space? What do you accept? What don't you accept? What do you need? What don't you need? All of that is communicated in setting boundaries. And so that versus walls are steeped in fear. One thing you need to understand, when you think of a wall, and you build this huge wall up in the physical world, out of it's largely built out of fear. But the other thing is, that fear gets amplified. Why? Because you're behind a wall, there's no communication. Dollars to donuts, you can't even see beyond that wall. Whereas when you set boundaries, you can see everything. You can see everything, you communicate. The only thing you're doing is creating the terms of engagement, is communicating what and taking what you need. Is We all have this, even within our physical bodies, at the cellular and microscopic level. We have boundaries. We don't have walls. Because what? Nutrients can't enter and enter cells, and cells can't get rid of waste if they're walled off. Cells die without being when they're impermeable. They have to be fed. The same thing applies to you at this level of humanity, at this level of awareness. And that's the beauty of knowing the difference between setting boundaries versus having walls. Walls are harmful. They even to some degree, I would say, give you some level of paranoia as well because oh, hey, happy birthday. Um, just wanted to say that. I just saw that in the comments. But anywho, it is important, especially as a Black woman in a society. This is why it is pivotal. And I will say, stand on my 10 toes and with my chest out and say, Black women need to understand the difference between boundaries and walls. Because in a society that has takes so much from us as a people and demands so much from us as women, both within our community, because we have these toxic things in our own communities. That's a story for another day, i.e., misogynoir. Patriarchy is alive and well around the world, and we are impacted, with by patriarchy in our communities as well. We have the upholders of patriarchy and misogyny in our community that we have to battle as well. And so, given the context of existing as a Black woman in this world, it's very easy to burn up when you don't, and burn out when you don't self care in the right way. Self care, when you don't use a decolonized version of self care, one. And two, when you confuse boundaries and walls. And this is why I say that, self-care too starts in the mind. It starts with awareness because at the mindset level, we are all impacted by white supremacy, anti-blackness, patriarchy, misogyny, whatever you want to call it. We do not exist in a bubble. And even if you have not experienced trauma, any real kind of trauma in your life growing up, at some point in your lineage, that trauma has been experienced and it's carried, and it's you carry it in your genes, you carry it in your body, and we internalize a lot of what happens around us just as human beings. Our environment conditions us to a lot. Our society conditions us to a lot. Our communities condition us. And so part of the self-care journey for Black women, for women, period, is deconstructing and breaking down the conditioning that we've been brought up with. Societal conditioning says that women do the bulk of mental and emotional labor, regardless of whether or not we work a full time job, regardless of whether we have other responsibilities. 90% of emotional and physical labor is done by women. A lot of it is unpaid or underpaid labor. And that has been conditioned into us to see that as normal. It's not. When you add on the extra baggage of caring society, being the social justice warrior, putting everyone else ahead of yourself. You see where I'm going with this. And so we've erected walls in the forms of these various archetypes of Black women, the strong Black woman, where you tough it out. You your rest is somewhere in some mythological heaven with some, your Your treasures are not on earth, they're up there somewhere. And so, what is it? I've heard a number of times, oh, you can rest when you die. No, why? Why? Is that not insane? So, it's no wonder we have so many issues with mental health and inflammation and poor health outcomes. So, you see where I'm going with this. So, again, emotional and energetic blockades, built from trauma, conditioning, survival based behaviors, all of these things are bricks in the walls that we have built as people, as Black women, as ways of surviving and navigating society. It's time to stop that. Let's start deconstructing all of that. While they are I'm just, thinking, as I speak, I'm, thinking at the same time. And, I'm just pondering how, yes, they're meant to protect, but, they end up isolating you from collective care and authentic healing and support. And that is my point when it comes to creating walls. They eventually crumble. They're rooted in fear. If you're hyper independent, that's a red flag for you, and you have a hard time with trust. It reinforces this white supremacist ideal of, self of stoicism, self denial, and it disconnects us from community and the whole notion of reciprocity, which is something that is a cultural trait of ours as a people and as a collective. And in spite of the trauma of being pulled and brutalized in the passage and living and existing in this country, we've still managed to hold on to the roots of that community and reciprocity. And that seem others have commodified that in when you see those archetypes of, where, who are the protesters on the front lines, whenever there is a social, problem, some injustice in the world, or that I remember the guy on TikTok who got dragged for saying, oh, he told his child that if you're ever in trouble, look for a Black woman. Say what? Bitch, what? Look for a Black woman to save your kid. Really? That's a whole nother rant. But you get where I'm going with this. And so those are things, believe it or not, are tied into white supremacy. They're tied into trauma. And when you begin to do the mental, emotional work, you begin to get more and more self aware. And you begin to, as you deconstruct this stuff, you begin to unpack it and release it. And a lot of times, it might seem on the surface that there's no real trauma involved until you actually start doing the mental and emotional work. And that's why I stress too that it's always a good idea to have a therapist, licensed therapist on your team. When it comes to advocating, asking for what you need, that is awareness, understanding that you need help. We're all human beings. We did not come to this planet individually by ourselves without some kind of support, under some supportive underpinnings. And in order to survive this long on this planet as a group called humanity, reciprocity and community are core to that. So why would you think your self-care needs to be divorced from that? That is white supremacy. That pull your boots, do you can do it on your own. Denial, you can do it on your own. Isolating, hyper independence. That is toxic. None of that is going to contribute to you being able to sustain your self care or health and wellness journey. So I just wanted to step on that and really speak to that because that was something that was bothering me. I wanted to address. I hadn't addressed it, and I don't believe I addressed that fully in a previous live or video, and I wanted to speak to that. And just to say this, at the end of the day, walls come from colonized survival. Boundaries come from liberated living. If there's anything you want to take away from this live, is that walls come from colonized survival. And that is true both here in the diaspora as well as the continent. When you're stuck in survival mode, trying to survive trauma, there's no safety there. There's no trust there. There's no community there. And then at the end of the day, there is no healing. Boundaries are liberating. They create a sense of trust. They allow you to be vulnerable. They allow you to be balanced and aligned because you're fully aware and in yourself. You're grounded. You are connected to your autonomy as a human being. You're able to move in that energy. So I hope that was helpful. I'll talk more about boundaries at some point, um, in the context of decolonized self-care at another point. I know I will have something else to say as my thoughts, as I marinate on my thoughts some more. But what I need us to understand, it's time for us as Black women to reclaim who we are, our energy, our time, our labor. And part of that process is practicing, engaging in decolonized self care and recognizing that your self care cannot take place in a place where there is no safety. It cannot take place in a place where there is no community of people who look like you. So if you're one of those people one of those Black women patting yourself, or women of color patting yourself on the back about being the only one in a predominantly white space, I don't know what to tell you. All I can say is get out of the sunken place, because you're fooling yourself if you think there's healing to be had there. I stopped going to, the regular gym for that reason alone, because I was like, why am I still feeling this energetic pressure in a place where I'm supposed to be working on getting fit and healthy? And I looked around and I was like, no shit. It's only three of us in here in a whole sea of non-Black faces. And that sense of unease, not feeling like you have to, have your head on a swivel, was humming in the background. And once I started deconstructing it, I'm like, oh, Lord, let me get up out of here because this ain't it. Contrast that with my experience in when I spent some time in Merida, Mexico, and I went to a yoga class there. Complete different energy. Why? I was surrounded by, even though I wasn't, like surrounded by tons of Black women, there were indigenous and non-Black, non-white women in that space only. It was just us, colored folk, if you will. And that feeling of culture, connection, community, which is something that is intrinsic to a number of Black and Brown communities, I felt that energetically. And so I felt safe in a way I did not feel being in a space where there were no Black and Brown bodies. I'm just going to leave it there. So, having said that, I hope this helped to give you some thoughts and help to trigger some self awareness for you, and to do some thinking in terms of what do you want your health and wellness journey to look like? Do you want it to look like the caricature of what's being popularized in mainstream media that does nothing for you? At the end of the day, when you leave that place, do you feel the same as when you went? One thing that self care should always do, it should always be grounding, it should always be healing, it should always be releasing, because there's sometimes when you're doing work on yourself where you're going to have to release a lot of stuff, and sometimes that can be emotionally draining, but it should, at the end of that process, create a sense of peace and groundedness that comes from releasing trauma, that comes from releasing pain, that comes from releasing anything, toxins, anything that doesn't serve you as a human being. So I hope that helps. And definitely tune in during the week when I will also be posting another video or I'll go live again. But typically, this is the time. Sundays are my days to go live at 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you're not following the channel already, please follow me here on YouTube. Just hit follow, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. I'm also on Instagram at Tonya Taria Health, and I post periodically there as well. But by and large, you can access a number of the resources, especially the ones I mentioned here in the live, at freedomatthecrossroads.com on my website. So sign up for the newsletter there, and then you'll be getting the newsletter once it starts coming out of the system. So have a good rest of your weekend. Stay well, so stay blessed, and decolonize your self care. Till next time. Bye.